Morning, fish keepers. Cam here from the fishroom.co.nz, and we've done it again. We've made it to Friday. Let's celebrate with coffee. And what a good coffee that it is. No major admin today. Just a quick reminder, the shop is open tomorrow if you're in Nelson from 10 until 3. Other than that, we've got a special guest on with us today, so I'm going to bring them both up. So we have Tai Strietman and John with us. Thank you very much.
How you doing?
Thank you. Thanks very much for joining us. It's much appreciated.
Thanks for having us.
Pleasure as always.
Cool. So, first thing I would like to know is how did you get into keeping aquariums and being interested in aquatic wildlife?
Me?
Yeah.
Sorry. Neglect. So I had a babysitter who my mum would take me to when I was about 2 years old and leave me at this lady's house. And retrospectively, the memories came to me that this lady put me on this black sofa and did nothing with me. I had no books, I had no toys, I had no stimulation whatsoever. But her boyfriend had a couple of fish tanks in the living room. And so I would sit on the floor and just stare up at these tanks. My earliest memories are green neon tetras, basically. And there was a shed in the garden which had racks of tanks where he was breeding stuff. And every now and then I was allowed to go out into this shed. And it meant by the time I was 3, after spending 18 months in this sort of, where my only stimulus was these fish for 6 hours a day, I was completely nuts about fish and fishing and water and everything. And my mum has always been very interested in nature and gardening, and I think that chimed in my father too, to an extent. And so I got my first fish tank after pestering when I was 8 years old, and just kind of went from there. There were moments when I wasn't so engaged, and others when it really took off again. But basically, that lady not doing her job gave me this great passion for freshwater fish and wildlife in general, I think.
Wow.
What a woman.
Yeah.
So,
Do you
my
remember
mum like that story? So
I bet she doesn't. Do you remember the first fish that you got in your first fish tank?
Yeah, it was a very lonely single black neon tetra in a kind of clear seal 60 centimeter tank with the old metallic lids and an undergravel filter, and there was plain gravel and a treasure chest with a diver, and that poor fish. I mean, but I didn't have any role models or guides to teach me. And,
didn't know any better.
Yeah, and the shops, my local shop, sadly, was just a case of hand over your money and here's your fish and away you go. So, but it was,
how long was it before you got your first aquarium book then to start learning?
Well, it's funny. I was given a book when I was given the tank. It wasn't bad, but I really struggled with reading. I couldn't read properly until I was about almost 11 years old. I had real issues. So it was kind of lost on me. It was pretty to look at the pictures, but I didn't. And I learned more through trial and error in my teens, because some of my friends had fish tanks, and I was like, I really want to go back to it and set up a tank again. And then I was able to look at the book and start reading more. And so I think I got the book when I was 8, but I wasn't really looking at it till I was 15, 16. And then, when I was 19, I made this friend, James Sampson, who I'm seeing tomorrow, who worked behind the counter in my local fish shop, and his guidance and influence and suggestions completely changed my outlook and my capability. So
cool.
So did you get into like specific setup styles early on?
Basically, I've been out to Brazil and Costa Rica, and I was interested. I've always been interested in rainforests and jungles, and my mum said, there's this fish shop that's opened up in the local garden centre. So I was back after sort of this gap year, and I walked in, and at the time that shop specialised in soft water and blackwater species, particularly South American. But and James was the guy behind the counter, and so I saw all these amazing fishes in these blackwater displays and on the racks, and I was like, these are so cool. And he was like, yeah, they're actually quite easy to keep, and this is how you would do it. And I they chimed with my interest in South America. I was about to go and do a degree in Latin American development studies, and it was, you know, all my childhood passion for the Amazon and jungles. It was like, right, I want to do South American fishes. And I live in a very hard water area, but James was like, look, you can use these special filter media, and here's how you would look after them. And so he got me really into keeping blackwater displays with particularly South American species, and later Southeast Asian reservoirs and stuff. And sorry, excuse my cat, who is also does come and interrupt sometimes. So yeah, definitely blackwater stuff. And then yeah, I've learned more and branched out over the years, but that's always been my kind of core interest.
Okay.
Yeah. Fantastic. So you've mentioned South America and exploring a little bit and stuff like that. So how did that side of it kind of start for you?
When I finished sixth form, I had no idea what I wanted to do, and a friend said, "Oh, why don't you go and do a teaching English course somewhere?" And I looked at doing it in Cambridge, where I live, and it was really expensive, and it was cheaper to fly to Costa Rica and spend 4 months there and do the course there than to do it here in my hometown. So I was like, all right, I saved up the money, worked all summers, and went there, and that kind of inspired an interest in the region, because I was also exploring mangrove swamps, and I saw four-eyed fish for the first time, and then I had some friends in Brazil, and I was like, I'm going to go to Brazil now. And I went to Brazil, kind of fell in love with the place, kept going back for several years doing volunteering in mangrove coastal environments. But it wasn't really until I went in 2015 after working for London Zoo. I was like, I'd been to the Amazon once in 2010, which was great, but I didn't see much in the way of fish. Mm-hmm. But then when I went to the Pantanal wetlands in 2015, and I was like snorkeling in these habitats where you could see the fish through crystal clear waters and walking through flooded meadows. And I was like, this is where I need to be. This is where I need to do whatever I do. This is where I need to do it.
Yeah,
that was a very seminal experience. Yeah. And that meant that every year after that, I went back to Brazil, and then I ended up going to do my master's out there, working with the fish communities of the Pantanal. So that kind of set the path.
So when I was doing a bit of research on you for this, fish communities did come up, and it was something that I'm sort of curious to know what that actually is. Okay. It's not something I'd sort of seen or heard before. So can you explain a bit what fish communities are?
Well, I guess like you're a cichlid guy, I think, to an extent.
A little bit of everything, yeah.
So like the sort of, you could call it the fish community of Lake Tanganyika or Lake Malawi or whatever is the composition of different species and their richness. So how many species and the abundance, how many individuals, how many fishes, are there. And I always look at how this collection of fishes changes over time and space. So how the wet season and the dry season and the physical and environmental changes that those brought, how that altered this community of different fish species. And your community of fishes could apply to those that are found in one particular lake, or across an entire length of a river, or in a particular region. And it's largely just referring to, the collection of species, and particularly their interactions with their habitats and with each other.
Okay. Cool.
So, it's a nice way of understanding, a collection of animals. Otherwise, you just look at it and you're like, oh, fish.
Yeah, I suppose it ties in with the biotope topic as well, because when you're understanding everything within that area, obviously that comes under the bracket of biotope. So I can understand where your interest in biotopes have kind of grew from fish communities' interest. So it's good.
Learning that everything has a niche and interacts or occupies or utilizes its habitat in a particular way, and that this can, completely connects with how every other species, fish or otherwise, is using that habitat. And that's why it's kind of the idea of a biotope is so appealing, because you're putting the animal in a display where it will exhibit, you hope, natural behavior, and you can suspend your disbelief and think you're looking at a slice of a Pantanal stream or Congo tributary or whatever. So
Yeah.
What are some of the things that you've maybe noticed changing, or some of the interactions that have kind of happened while you've been sort of working with fish communities? Is there anything that's really stood out to you or really surprised you?
I guess one thing, and I suppose you see it with sharks in your public aquarium, you think that predators are just all the time going to be on the hunt, and the prey items are just constantly going to be acting as if there's a predator around. Even so, you'd see the freshwater dogfish, the Ancestorhynchus, big, toothy, lightning fast, torpedo shaped fish. And there's all these tiny tetras, which they eat just chilling around them. Yeah. Because at that moment, the dogfish is not in hunting mode. And the dynamic, in a split second, it changes. You see suddenly, it's into its hunting mode. It's preparing to track down, and normally they push small fishes up against the bank, and the fish have nowhere to go, and the whole dynamic changes. And then after he's caught his prey, everything just kind of settles down again. And I imagine it must be similar to herds of wildebeest or zebra on the savannah. There's lions around, but if you're constantly stressed because lions are around, you're not going to live very long, and you're going to exhaust yourself. So they adapt very quickly to the change in the dynamic. So that was very, very interesting to observe. Also, the other thing that I learned was the books. Fish books are great, and when they say this species is kept at this temperature with this pH and moderate flow, and that is a snapshot of an animal's life, and it's the snapshot that was taken by the people who originally collected this creature often, or the first people to keep it in aquaria. But actually, it's one photo from a huge album. Your fish that you've been told only handle extreme black water, stagnant, warm, sluggish environments. You turn around the corner of the river and it's there in this crystal cool running water over pebbles in incredible flow, and you're like, what? Black neon tetras, for example. I've been in creeks with them where I had to hug onto sunken logs to not be swept away, and they were just kind of gliding in the water like, what are you doing? But if you wouldn't read that really in the literature. So it was kind of understanding that fish particularly are so adaptable. That's why they're so successful in all their forms to such a host of environments, but also that along the course of a stream or within a lake, there's multiple environmental dynamics which change, and the only way that most fishes can survive in them is to be able to adapt to various scenarios. And it was very useful, when you talk to someone who perhaps is very good at keeping a particular fish but has never been to the habitat, and they say, this fish is only found in this environment at this temperature, and you're like, no, here's a video of it in a completely different environment that I've seen. I think that's important because the literature and the books are so vital for many fish keepers, but people can become very set in their ways, and people lose an understanding of the incredible adaptability of species.
Okay. On that note, it's something that you do experience when you go to a local fish club and you're speaking to two different people about discus fish. One person will say that they have great success in one type of condition, and they say that's the best conditions for the fish. But the man over here will say that he has the best conditions under completely different. So and the adaptability is one thing, but I think as long as the conditions are stable, no matter what they are, stability is more important than anything else, and they can adapt when it's stable.
That is exactly right. And I think the example I always use, if aliens came down and kidnapped someone from, suburban Glasgow or Wellington and took them back and said, this is a human being, this is how they live, and this is how and then someone else came down and kidnapped someone who lives in, the Central Sahara, or an indigenous, person from the Amazon basin, or even someone in, busy urban Hong Kong, and took them back and said, well, actually, this is how humans live, and this is how they act. You'd be like, whoa. So it's the same with fishes.
I think if aliens were to come down and take somebody from Glasgow, they might not come back.
You pulling your green skin out. Yeah.
Yeah.
I had a slight surreal experience that when I went to the Amazon, I chose to stay in a lodge as far away from tourists as I could near Leticia, because I was tired of being asked by British people where could I find the best drugs, and I said, back in London where they send it, and I arrived at this, really out in the sticks bed and breakfast, and it turned out to be owned by a lovely guy, Steve McAleer, who's from Birmingham here in the UK, and he loaned me a DVD of Still Game, which is this wonderful Scottish comedy series.
Yeah.
And so I had this surreal experience of being in this wooden kind of cabin with the sounds of the Amazon rainforest at night sort of crushing in around me in this humidity, and I'm watching Still Game with these kind of Glaswegian pensioners living in apartment blocks arguing over things, and it was totally out of this world. I thought, I bet no one apart from me and Steve have ever done this.
No, I don't think it will be.
But it was a good memory.
Yeah.
So, continuing with your time with your studies in Brazil and in the waters and stuff like that, what, I guess, from the fish that are generally considered in the hobby, what are the ones that you've sort of experienced the most, spent your most time with, and have sort of fascinated you the most while you're being in their natural environments?
So species that we know well in the hobby, black widow tetras, Gymnocorymbus tenitsae, Corydorus aeneas, Corydorus hastatus, the Aphiocarax, Rathbuni naturari and anisitsi, the bloodfin tetras, Mesonauta festivus, let me think, banjo catfish, various banjo catfish, in terms of tetras, Hemigrammus ulreae, and then Serpe tetra, Hyphisibricon black phantom tetra, Hyphisibricon megalopterus, which in the region I was working in are not black, they're red, which is kind of cool. Hyphisibricon ilakis, the little sedge tetras, which are beautiful fish. Cichlids, Epistogramma borelli, Trifasciata, Combrae, giant silver hatchet fish, the Thoracarax stellatus, lots of different loricarids, Rhine loricaria parva, orata, Hippostomus basilisco, Hippostomus boulangeri, various ancestris. Those would be the sort of the most common ones. Corydorus polystictus, which isn't so common in the hobby, but people are keeping them. And Corydorus britsky, the really big giant cories, collected them quite a lot. And then things like, for the monster fish keepers, piranha, wolffish, stingrays, I'd be fed up because I'd be trying to film small tetras, and below me is a Potamotrigon motoro hunting for crabs and using my body, I think, as a distraction, as cover to get near the prey, which is kind of cool. Those would be the main aquarium species that I've encountered there, and some of the pimelodids as well, different catfish, Pimelodus gracilis, and so on.
Well, you've been doing this for quite a long time now. Have you noticed any species decreasing in population in the wild since you've started?
It's difficult to. Every time you get into a habitat, again, it is a snapshot. I think for me to have seen population decline, really, you'd have to be doing it for like 20 years across vast areas. And I think from the literature and from anecdotal evidence-based conversations I've had with colleagues, generally there is a decline because habitats are declining, fish numbers are declining. From my own experience, I saw habitats that were really degraded or destroyed, whether that was people ripping out all the marginal vegetation, particularly to allow access for cattle to come down to the water and drink, and then that ruins the riverbank, and that causes sedimentation, and then you get nutrient excess in the water, and then you get algae, so all the aquatic plants get smothered. People ripping out all the trees so they can plant soy right up to the river, And of course, you remove the trees, you remove the roots. Again, you get bank collapse and erosion. One of the ones that I hadn't expected that I learned quite a bit about was the deliberately set fires to clear land for cattle and soy. So fire is a really natural occurrence in the Pantanal, but it happens in a very narrow window between the end of the dry season and the beginning of the wet season. So the landscape is bone dry. Like you have this swamp that just drains. It becomes this arid savanna. And there's all this dead wood. And then the rains arrive at the end of November and there's loads and loads of lightning. And then, of course, there's all these dead trees and dead grass, lightning catches. But because it's the beginning of the wet season, within a day, there's huge rainstorms and it puts the fires out. It's a very important part of the ecological system. But the deliberately set fires are always set in high summer when it's easiest to burn everything. But the rain doesn't come to put things out. Yeah. So the fires run riot, they burn vast tracts of land, and they burn these meadows that in the wet season are flooded. And the flood meadows are the nurseries for the fishes. When the waters rise during the floods, all the fish move out of the main river channels into the meadows because a lot of the vegetation can survive partially or mostly immersed. And there's flooded forest, there's flooded scrub, there's access to insects and larvae and all this other additional food. And there's cover to raise young and stuff. But if you burn all of that, they move out of the main river channels and there's just this flooded desert of black ash. And so it was snorkeling in those kind of environments and finding that there was not a single fish because there was no vegetation. So there was no microinvertebrates. The ground had been burned through. There was nothing to be the basics of the food chain. So going up, there were no fish, no birds, no nothing. And fire is a massive issue and it's increasing and land is being cleared at such a rate. And so in a small way, I could perceive that this is evidence of decline and I'd only seen a snapshot of it. But if you imagine this multiplied again and again and again and again over vast areas, you remove the resources of the wet season, which fuel the next year's boom of fishes. And that will have a very quick and detrimental impact.
That's a shame. Why do people set fires on purpose? What's the game for these people?
95% of the Pantanal and most of the land in Brazil is privately owned. Right. And many of these farms are massive. You know, it's not unusual to have a farm that's perhaps like in Australia, you know, it's half the size of Belgium or bigger. And it'll be owned by one family and they are very powerful farmers and also, you know, big businessmen who've made a lot of money. They buy up some cattle ranches. Technically, the environmental laws in Brazil are very strict. Bolsonaro did a lot of damage to them, but technically, you know, there's fines to be paid if you uproot things, but everything takes a long time. It's very easy to stall things in the court. If you have one lawyer, you can hold off a fine for 20 years until it gets, you know, the statute of limitation expires. So it's very easy for you to tell your farmhands, you know, who are the guys down at the bottom, who will be the ones arrested if the environmental police do turn up. Say, hey, you know, I want you to clear out the meadows on the west side of the ranch because we want to use it for pasture, or we're going to dig up the soil to plant soy because it's so lucrative. It's just so bloody lucrative. And the consequences never really touch the big guys. You know, maybe the local environmental police arrest some farm guys for environmental crime, but you know, a lawyer from the big farm will turn up the next day and there's just no consequence. So this is why they do it, because they can and because the result is more money. So I think Brazil has some of the most detailed and advanced environmental legislation in the world, and it's one of the countries with the highest rates of environmental crime in the world.
Wow.
Because it's not implemented.
Yeah.
You just had someone in the chat basically say that the laws are strict and modern, but they're just not enforced.
Andre Mushagata, yeah, I know him. He's moved to New Zealand from Brazil.
Yeah.
And we were chatting the other day. Exactly. He understands, you know, the frustration of like going into the field down a road where, you know, a month before there were all these beautiful large trees, and then you go and the trees are gone. And you're like, where are they've gone? And the farmer, the rancher, takes a digger, a bulldozer, scoops the tree out of the ground, buries it in the hole where the roots were, covers it over with topsoil. There was never any tree. If environmental inspectors come, what tree? And they'll do that to, 30, 40, 50 trees along a rural road. And they can do it overnight if they have 2 or 3 diggers. And I was working as a bilingual guide for a ranch, for an eco resort. And we went out one morning to drive past this road because in these trees, there was quite a good chance of seeing some local birds that were, different hawks and stuff. And I got on the radio, I said, guys, the trees have gone. And in the night, the adjacent farmer to the ranch had used 3 diggers to just bury the trees. And you're literally burying the evidence. So it's really depressing. And there's so many Brazilian scientists and conservationists and ecologists. Brazil produces more natural history papers than any other country in the world, who are desperate to, record and try and promote and produce attention. But they're up against this tsunami of very ingrained kind of agro-political power confluences and indifference. Many Brazilians are very poor. They're focused on feeding the kids, getting home safely.
Mm-hmm.
What happens in the Pantanal 2,000 kilometers away, or in the Amazon 3,000 kilometers to the north? I mean, what's it got to do with me?
Yeah.
And I think it's one of the reasons perhaps Andre will agree with me that, there's a lot of feeling in Brazil, the West and other countries blaming almost individual Brazilians. Oh, look at what you're allowing to happen. It's like, well, we're really busy just trying to survive. And
it's easy for people to judge and say, oh, you shouldn't do that. This is such a natural resource. But these people, they're forced into that because there's no alternative. There isn't any other industry they can work in. They either work in mining, illegal farms in the middle of the jungle, or forestation. And
exactly. And this is the thing, you see the guys on the TV with the chainsaws in the Amazon, and you feel real antipathy towards them. Look at this guy. But exactly as you said, what is the alternative?
Yeah.
And unless the state is there saying, hey, we're going to train you, we're going to provide work, we're going to, and there are programs that try and do that. So, training people as forestry engineers or as guards, but there's only so many people you can do that with.
Yeah.
So it's a very tricky situation. And invariably, the people who are caught are always the small fry.
Mm-hmm.
It's always up the food chain. There's a big landowner, probably a senator as well, who has all this money and land and power, and it's a very sort of almost a feudal system in some ways.
Yeah,
and it sucks because you get, like I said, the privilege of seeing all these amazing fishes in the wild. I mean, I wish I could bring every biotope and fish enthusiast in the world to come and see what I'm seeing, and you wonder if that creek is going to be there next year or even next month. So
is it being destroyed at such a rate that next month you're thinking it might not be there?
Wow. And a lot of the habitats for particular species, so Brazil has a massive array of killifish, a lot of seasonal killifish, particularly in the Cerrado grasslands. So actually the biggest biome in Brazil is not the Amazon, it's the Cerrado. It's this traditional sort of savanna landscape. And it's being converted into agriculture and mostly into agriculture far faster than the Amazon. And across its sort of length and breadth, it has lots and lots of these little seasonal pools, which are home to the seasonal killifish. And sometimes you'll have one pool and one species, and that is the habitat of that entire species. And, if a farmer decides to fill in the pool because he wants to plant over it, or he diverts the water for irrigation one year, we went to habitats where, the original type locality was already being drained to become pasture, and killifish were living in a depression by the highway, which was from where the earth was taken to build the highway, and they'd managed to wriggle and crawl from the remaining pools up the road into this depression. And in the wet season they were there, and in the dry season they were gone. But you were wondering, there's no other pool around. Where have they gone? And yeah, you can turn up and the habitat's gone from 1 week to the next, and it's really, really frustrating.
Would be. I can imagine it would be. Yeah. Are you? We just had a question.
Sure.
Are you aware of any sort of pH changes or water condition changes after these fires when they get, the rainy season comes along and gets into the waterways? Does that affect dramatically, or?
Yeah, I mean, you've basically removed all the vegetation and organic matter in a habitat, which is the fuel for all the bacteria, which, like in our filters, you need them to purify the water, and so you end up with these kind of lifeless environments. But once the ash has settled, they become quite clear, and that's excellent conditions for algae. So you get these algal blooms, and they can use up all the oxygen. They can smother the environment, particularly the erosion of the riverbanks. You get all this excess nutrients going into the water. That also causes bacterial and algal blooms, which suffocate fish and other animals. You're basically pulling, I always think of ecosystems and habitats as Jenga towers, right? And each brick is a component. And if you start pulling out the vegetation and the microfauna, the microinvertebrates, those are the bricks at the bottom. The stingrays and the crocodiles, those are the bricks at the top. And you pull out, you start reducing those, the ecological tower is reduced. But if you pull out the little bricks at the bottom, the macroinvertebrates, the bacteria, the smaller plants, the diatoms, everything starts to fall apart very quickly. And those water chemical issues you see from mining operations as well, augmented levels of mercury, and because of all the soy farming, loads and loads and loads of phosphates, pesticides, lots of pesticides. Brazil is the #1 consumer of pesticides in the world, and it buys pesticides mostly from 5 producers who are based in the US, Germany, and Switzerland. And those guys produce pesticides that are banned in their own countries. So we've got producers in the EU producing pesticides that are banned in the EU, sold to Brazil, where they're used, and invariably they get into the water system. So it's not only that you've converted the landscape into farmland, any remaining aquatic habitats is very quickly going to start feeling the impact of all those agrotoxins entering.
Wow.
Yeah.
I can assure you this isn't a topic that I thought we were going to get onto today. I'm glad we have. It's just yeah.
I mean, there's causes for hope, and I would say, the resilience of nature is one of those things. If you give it time and space, things can bounce back and reestablish themselves surprisingly quickly. But there's a limit to which you can push it.
Yeah.
But for instance, mangrove restoration is a great example. Mangroves can be really badly degraded and damaged, but if you replant mangroves, very quickly ecosystems reestablish themselves. Same with reefs. If you give reefs a breather, life will come back. And there are lots of people doing very good work and far-reaching work to try and protect, not just Brazilian wetlands and rivers, but across Latin America. But it's just making people aware of what's happening, and then making sure that there are voices beyond Brazil.
Yeah. So that leads me quite well to, you're obviously aware of there's some conservation groups that are working in these areas and stuff like that. Which ones are you aware of that are working with them? Are you involved in anything in those areas?
I'm not involved in any conservation efforts myself. I was more sort of linked to working groups, kind of academic groups, and unfortunately, there's sometimes a bit of space between the scientists on the ground doing the work and the conservation organizations who've got the resources to do the things that need doing. It's very hard to have this sort of an in-country office that's connected to scientists who can give you the data that tell you what you need to do. But organizations that, I think it's for me, Wetlands International, and there's also the Migratory Fish Project. But to be honest, any organization, even if it focuses on, say, a non-aquatic species, a target species, it has these knock-on effects that other species benefit from the conservation efforts. So there's the giant armadillo project Tatu Canastre. It's based in Campo Grande, run by one amazing French guy called Arnaud. It's all about promoting these amazing animals and conserving them. And they chiefly live in the sort of the Cerrado landscape and in more arid areas of the Pantanal. But if you protect those habitats, it then ensures that, you know, the wider ecosystem is protected. And for instance, he's managed to get Disney on board. So they get most of their funding from Disney, which is impressive. Wow. And then you get that kind of, you get a charismatic animal with real heavy hitting donors behind you. And then you say, oh yeah, you know, this animal lives in this place and we need to preserve it and protect it and create a stable environment. And that has the knock-on effects of, you know, local waterways will benefit, other species will thrive, all of this. It's difficult. Off the top of my head, I can't pick out any particular, you know, aquatics-based organizations in the Pantanal. But there are some local ones like it's Instituto de Homem Pantaneiro. It's like the Institute of the Pantanal Man. And they do lots of work with sort of local landowners, farmers, rural communities, basically to say, look, you've got these amazing resources around you, they are disappearing. You need to have ownership because you are stakeholders in this. And they do all kinds of training, you know, get local people who otherwise would, as you were saying, John, there's no alternative. But with this training, they can become eco guides, they can become field scientists. Yeah. So there's lots of smaller organizations that are doing as much as they can. But there's no real sort of giant umbrella organization. And that's one of the issues, I think. There needs to be a voice that brings together all these disparate groups.
Yeah. Wow. We've had another question from the floor. Did you have any experience with the Rio Negro? And I'm not even going to try and pronounce that.
Hemigramus.
There we go.
So I haven't been to the Rio Negro myself, but I have kept these fish, and they are amazing. As I'm sure questioner knows, they can color up when they get into breeding colors. This amazing, vivid red across the body. My main frustration with them was that they didn't want to do that, despite my best efforts to trigger kind of spawning behavior with water changes. And I know that they take a very long time to get settled. They're quite skittish. They will jump, so you really need cover glasses on them. My friend Ediberto in Brazil has just lost 7 in one night. And so they need cover. I think they just need a long time to settle in. They're one of these fishes that you cannot, you know, take home and in a week they look good and in a month they're spawning. I think there are species that really, I'm sure they would thrive in an authentic kind of Rio Negro blackwater habitat. I think recently I saw a video on YouTube, maybe from the Piaba project team, with those species. So there's definitely some information on YouTube as to the habitats that could give you an insight into their environment. But in the aquarium, they need really calm, stable, you know, they do not like it when you go in and do maintenance, for example. At least mine didn't. They were terrified of me. Once they settled in, however, they start, you can see the males starting to do some display behavior, but I think it's really a fish that needs a calm, long-term environment where it's not bothered, you know. It's one of those species you need to be patient with.
So do you think a larger aquarium would be more suited?
They do become quite large. They grow to, you know, and I always have to convert this. I would say 3 inches, so what, 8-9 centimeters quite easily. Wow. Mine grew pretty fast, actually. And they really, really benefit from decent live and frozen foods. So I used to feed mine fruit flies, Drosophila, which they absolutely loved, and that actually brought out their confidence. I've done that with a few fish. Elestopetius smikeli is the sort of blue tetra from Nigeria. Quite similar. It's really shy for the first month or two. It's really hard to get it into nice condition and get it confident. As soon as I started feeding fruit flies, their kind of inner piranha came out, and they were much more active. They were out and about. They were looking for food. They were coming up to the surface, and I could move about in front of the tank without them fleeing into the vegetation. So it might be worth trying that with the hemigrammus as well.
Mhm.
As soon as you stimulate natural behaviors, that can override fear in a sense.
Yeah, cool. Just had another question regarding we sort of encourage to keep dwarf cichlids in pairs. Do they survive in pairs, or sorry, are they naturally found in pairs in the wild? Which also leads me to what I was sort of working towards is, what are some of the differences that you found from seeing fish in their natural way to then keeping them in the aquarium? What different behaviors do they exhibit for different environments?
So the thing I noticed, particularly with Pistogramma combrae and Pistogramma trifasciata, is much more than a pair. It's a harem system. You'll have one male with maybe 5, 7 females around him over quite a large area. So trifasciata, where there's kind of leaf litter and submerged root networks along the banks, there'll be this male with these females around, and any other male who comes nearby will be chased off. He is the dominant. He's got the females. The combrae are slightly more chilled out, but I would see, you know, large males with sub males and various females hanging around together on the substrate. Pistogramma borelli, I never observed them underwater. I would collect them, and we'd find them in very low numbers. So it makes me think that they might be more perhaps pair orientated, or one of the behaviors that I really enjoyed watching so much was the Rathbun's tetra, Apheocaryx rathbuni. Stunning fish. In the Pantanal, they're particularly green, at least where I was working. They're really, really green. And I was like, why are they so green? You know, yes, they're eating lots of natural food, and then I was snorkeling in a flooded meadow, which had only been flooded for a few days, and it was full of really tall grasses that were covered in algae because stagnant, clear water, tropical sun, lots of algae. And these Rathbun's tetras were everywhere in little gangs of 3 to 7, picking at all the algae on the plants. And I've noticed since that in aquaria, if you watch them, they're constantly picking and pecking. They're actually quite good as a cleanup crew at tiny bits of algae and detritus on vegetation. So I thought maybe it's because they're so green, because they're getting such a level of algal content during the wet season. And that was a behavior that I had not observed. I had never heard about it in literature. I had not seen it. So you begin to think, oh, okay, you know, what else? What other stories are out there? There's some things that are really cool, like Corydorus hastatus, you know, that said, oh, they swim in the mid-water and they mingle with other tetras. But it's only when you actually see it in front of you, you know, 200 or 300 of these tiny cories, and they're almost invisible in the sort of semi-murky water until they're about 30 centimeters in front of you. And they're in with all these little tetras that have the same black and white pattern on the caudal, near the caudal peduncle, near the tail fin. And suddenly like, oh, those are Corydorus. And so there's also moments where your knowledge is confirmed and reaffirmed, but until you actually see it, you don't quite envisage it, and you won't see it in the same way in the aquarium. I guess the other thing that you really picked up on is how species, in some ways like birds, really mix together. So you have mixed species shoals of various fishes, mostly characins, but maybe some others that will join in. We always think in the aquarium, I'm going to have a shoal of 12 Serpae tetras and 10 Rathbun's tetras and 12 black phantoms or whatever, and they're going to be like this and this and this. And then in the wild, particularly in the wet season, when these fishes come together to breed and the numbers increase, you just get these shoals that pass you for a couple of minutes with just thousands and thousands of mixed species in there. And it's basically safety in numbers. It's very informative on thinking, okay, what's the dynamic going to be in my aquarium? And one of the issues with many of these tetras, if you do put them in the aquarium, it's a confined space. You get conflicts because of hierarchy. The sub males can't escape. They can't get out of the line of sight. So they're constantly picked on until they die. So these fish get unfair reputations as, fin nippers or whatever. But it's just understanding the dynamic and how they should be kept together. And yeah, you observe all sorts of little scenarios. Pike cichlids are very popular, the Crenocycla. So you start to see Quenocycla lepidota. This is quite slender pike cichlid that hangs out in the lower levels, and Quenocycla semifasciata, I think sometimes they're known as belly crawlers. They really sit on the substrate, and you'll see them foraging kind of together. And then you see these very long, slender catfish, Pimula della gracilis, also foraging alongside the semifasciata, and they look very similar. They've got almost the same pattern. And the semifasciata have got these like chameleon eyes that are constantly looking for prey, but also for danger. And the gracilis have these upward facing eyes, so they can very program towards seeing predators from above, and their whiskers let them search for prey in the sand. So the gracilis are moving along, disturbing the sand, shuffling it, watching out for prey above, and right behind them are following the Quenocycla semifasciata, who are picking at any items that are uncovered by the catfish and not gobbled up, but also keeping a watch out to the sides, the back, everywhere for predators. There's all these little relationships that you begin to observe.
Wow.
You see it once and you go, oh, okay, that's cool. But then you see it 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times, and they only do it over sandbanks or around leaf litter. But at night they kind of split apart and do their own thing, and you begin to see all these patterns. And it's really cool. You're like, oh wow. So
That's neat. That's really neat. And again, you don't experience that in your aquarium because we just don't have the ability to do that. Wow, that's fantastic.
I think for people who want to set up natural style displays, it can be daunting. Like, oh, do I need a massive aquarium to produce a multi-species shoal? Not necessarily. In many cases, you will find a group of 5 Serpae tetras hanging out here, and a couple of Rathmann's tetras over here, and maybe a few Laeticara dorsigera around a log. The difference is that there is habitat and space beyond that, but if with careful planning, you can do that. You can keep 5 or 6 little fishes very successfully in a small display, and it's authentic and it works. But it just requires doing some research and studying and making sure they'll be happy long term.
I've noticed. Saw recently you posted a picture of a Serpae tetra. Are they a fish that's always interested you, or have you just recently found a new love for them, or how do they sit for you in your heart of fish?
They're symbolic of my learning curve. So I think when I was beginning to go a bit mad and getting loads of fish and fish tanks, and I think I was 21 or something, and I read about Serpae tetras, these fin nipping, ultra aggressive, psychopaths, and I set this tank up for only them because God forbid I put anything else in, they would be torn apart. And I just didn't know. I'd read these accounts online, and everyone said, "Oh, don't keep them," or they'll nip the fins off everyone. And then through reading, learning, observing, working in the aquarium trade, working at London Zoo, I was like, this is rubbish. As long as you have 10 or 12 of them and they've got room and there's broken lines of sight, they ignore everyone else. They're just focused on their own little dynamics.
Yeah.
And so they were one of the fishes that I saw in the wild the first time in Bonito, in the Bodequera Highlands. And I was just like, look how amazing they are, and look how red they are, and oh my god! And I've kept those at home. I've had those in my tanks, and they were the first fish I think that I saw that I had kept.
Yeah,
and that made me like, wow. And then I was very fortunate to have as my eventually as my supervisor in my masters, Fernando Carvalho, Dr. Fernando Carvalho, who it turns out is the world authority on Hyphosabricon, and his favorite fish on the planet is the Serpae tetra. So I got all this amazing taxonomic and life history knowledge from him, and everywhere we went, I'm very much I call myself a scientist, but I'm an observational scientist. I like to watch what they're doing and try and infer theories based on what I see in front of me. Fernando is very much a taxonomist, and could tell you the history and the lineage of everything, and it means I learned so much from him. But I was also able to put forward theories and ideas and suggestions, which he said, "Oh, that's really cool. I hadn't thought of it." And so that little fish, it ultimately became the symbol of our lab, and it was one of the most common that I would encounter in every habitat almost. and you see them, they look so so beautiful, and they're so maligned in many senses, but I always thought they were just amazing. And yeah, I think that's definitely my sort of key fish. Those and the black neons were the two species that were just like, wow. So
I think when you're a fish keeper and you go over to a place like Brazil, you've always got in the back of your mind that there's a fish that you want to see. Because, you know, for me, I've never been over there, but I would love to see Microgeophagus ramirezi in the wild.
Oh yeah,
that's one fish that if I could see one in the wild, it would have to be them. During the migration season in the savannas. There's something special about that. That's because when I did my biotope, I based it on that, and I've got a lot of connection with that particular setup. So I can understand how you would feel when you see that fish for the first time in the wild.
You have an affinity with it, especially, you know, a charismatic and beautiful fish like the rams. And as you know, I'm talking to you on mycology. I'm sure he, you know, tells you about how they live in the llanos, and you see his photos, and they're just as amazing, if not way more so, and beautiful in the wild as, you know, when kept in a tank. And they're busy living their lives and exhibiting the same behaviors, and, you know, starting fights with each other and quarreling and trying to spawn. And I think that's, the pull of seeing that in the wild is fantastic and very strong, and it's such a privilege to be able to do it. You'll need to talk to Ivan about maybe doing some trip to the Colombian llanos, because Venezuela's not possible, but Colombia he knows very well, and, you know, who knows, you might get to see them in the wild.
You never know. Maybe one day.
Yeah.
Maybe one day. But a dream come true.
I know before you spoke about how one day a habitat might not be there again. Have you been on multiple times over there and been to the same spot over and over again, and just, you know, that is your kind of happy place, or do they just get destroyed too fast for you to be able to go back and record and photograph and all that kind of stuff?
I mean, the river I know best is the Salobra River in Mato Grosso do Sul in the southern Pantanal. It is the only river in the state where fishing recreationally is prohibited. So, but it's under constant pressure from illegal fishermen, especially targeting large dorado because they grow there. From the surrounding farmers, this is where, you know, those trees were dug up and buried. From people wanting to start their own kind of fast and loose eco lodges, which aren't really eco lodges, and just bring more noise and pollution. And so I'm sure that's a place that, you know, every time I went back to, you'd notice something else, but I'm sure that I would over time notice negative issues as well. I mean, I think climate, there was a lake that I went to just outside Campo Grande, which I've been to a couple of times now, and it's where I saw Serpe tetras in a lake environment, blackwater lake, just covered in the most beautiful red lilies and full of Cobomba facata, pink Cobomba, in a blackwater environment, and particular kind of Eliocharis. My friend Juliana helped me find the name, which was like a sort of umbrella type Eriocaul on it, stunning. And in my mind, it was like, wow, this lake is huge and it's going to be here all the time. So I'll come back in a couple of months and visit it. And I went back and there was nothing there. It was just sand. So it turned out to be a seasonal lake. So the fishes enter and the plants, you know, sit in the mud and the clay and then erupt forth. So I thought, okay, well, I'll just wait till the next wet season. So the region goes through these sort of cycles of 7 years of good rain, and then a really late wet season with a prolonged drought, and then another 7 years. I mean, it's very anecdotal, this kind of the folklore of it. But in the years that I was doing my master's there, we had droughts in succession and for much longer and much more intense. So I never got to see that lake fill up again. And there was a little bit of rain and you could see the plants, mayacas, nymphaeas, Cobombas, emerging out of the clay. But within a day or two, they were completely
just
desiccated because the rain didn't continue and it didn't come back and it wasn't as forceful and it didn't arrive when it should. And so this is climate change, I'm sure, because people were saying, wow, this prolonged drought and the weak rains and the fact that the rains are, falling so infrequently and it's such a small amount of water. This happened last year, and it happened kind of the year before, and this is not usual. So there's bound to be habitats that I'm very familiar with, that if I were to go back now, they would be altered. And you go back and you see, I went to the northeast of Brazil with my friend Juliana last year, who lives out there, amazing botanist. And we went to creeks where she was like, oh, you're going to love it. It's full of, aquatic vegetation and it's amazing. And we go, and the landowner had just ripped it all out and plonked some plastic chairs in there and was charging entry for people to come and sit and drink a beer in the stream. It ripped out all the vegetation because it was, annoying and it didn't feel nice. So of course, all the fish go, and that's in a tiny creek in an obscure region in a small private holding. Multiply that by how many other tens of thousands. And yeah, you're going to encounter habitats that are gone.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, but again, as I said, it's the resilience of nature. If you give it the space and the time to recuperate, it comes back. And this is what I say to people. People will say, oh, we're destroying the planet. So no, we are destroying humanity. We will go, if we keep on the current path, the world will be drastically altered, species will be lost, habitats will be changed and degraded, and some will be destroyed. But if we disappear, you give it a couple of decades only, and the resurgence of nature will be intense.
Yeah.
The trick is to find a way to accompany nature's trajectory on the same path as humanity, so we can enjoy it and benefit from it and protect it.
So biotoping is something that interests me quite a bit. It's obviously something that you do quite a bit of. What kind of leads you into wanting to biotope in your aquariums? Is it literally because you've been out there with it and you just want to keep that piece, or was there something that just clicked with you? This is the way that I want to keep aquariums.
I think the first time was with my friend James kind of encouraging me. It was like, look, get some play sand, get some blackwater extract and some bits of brushy wood, and you've got an authentic biotope. And I was like, this is too easy, right? It's too easy, it's too cheap, and yet the fish colors look amazing. They seem really at home in the environment. I think it was with rummy noses in a 120 centimeter tank. They just look incredible. And then the more I learned about leaf litter environments, I was like, oh, that's so cool. The dynamic of, the organic material breaking down, and that supplies fuel for microinvertebrates, and then the fish feed on that. Like my friend Scott Tannen in the States, who ran a tank with green neons without feeding them. He just kept refueling the leaf litter, and they got really fat. Yeah, he did it for a year as an experiment, and they were fine. They ate all the microinvertebrates that erupt on the leaf litter. And then as I learned more and more about keeping aquarium plants and seeing them in the wild and understanding their needs, I was like, you could make a planted biotope. You can have your beautiful nature aquarium or your Dutch escape, but you can create a slice of verdant, rich habitat. And every day you come down and there's a new leaf, or there's a little flower, or another shoot has appeared. It's a living, breathing art, and you are in charge of it. You're responsible for it. Your success is its success. Your love and attention will help those animals and plants flourish, and it will reward you by being dynamic and different every day. And I was like, that's ridiculously cool that I can put with even just one species of fish and plant, I can create a slice of a Brazilian river in a glass box in my suburban English house, and I can sit in front of it, and I'm transported 9,500 miles west to the Bordequeda Highlands of Brazil, and the fish, they're acting the same as when I've seen them in the wild. And so for me, that's what biotopes, it's that bringing people, connecting people with nature. And often, I'm so privileged that I've been able to go out there so often. It's not a financially easy thing to do. It's logistically difficult. It's even once you're there, it's not easy to find the places, nowhere to go. And yet I say to people, bring it to you, bring the habitat to you. And if you become interested in it, and if people become interested in a habitat and a species, then maybe it raises their consciousness as to what's happening to those habitats in the wild. They start reading about it. You might be absolutely passionate about wild betters because you saw a wild better, and I'm going to do a blackwater tank, and you read up about it, and palm oil is destroying that habitat. So you decide to stop buying shampoo with palm oil. And it's the most minuscule, minute, purportedly inconsequential action in the universe that you could do, but you weren't doing it yesterday. And you're doing it today because you fell in love with a little fish and you learned about its habitat and you began to understand the wider context and you saw what the human activity was doing to it, and you took action in your own small way to not be part of it. And I think that's the great power of biotopes as well. It's just you can connect someone in a suburban living room in the UK or in New Zealand with a little fish in Brazil or Indonesia and make them give a damn about the habitat.
Exactly. Wow. I mean, there's something as well with I think it was Ivan. Yes, it was Ivan. He was set up an aquarium at the side of a river, and he would show the kids in the local town what was living in that river. And for them, it was just the river where they played and didn't really respect. But when they seen the beauty in there, they looked at that like it was a special river. You know, it totally transformed it just by showing them what it looked like underwater.
And that is a magical moment to be able to be part of. I think perhaps it's the same in New Zealand, but you know, as you'll know, John, every primary school, they take you to the country park and they give you these like peaking boxes and some dip nets, and you go around in the summer and you collect all these little shrimp and daphnia and maybe a stickleback out of your local lake, and the kids are connected with a world that they had no idea existed, didn't, you know, understand. It was just the lake where the ducks are or where, you know, you swim in the summer, but there's this environment. So then if you magnify that with what's living in tropical environments, the impact is amazing for children. I had a really nice moment on this trip with Juliana. We were in this quite degraded river. You could see tilapia swimming around. You could see invasive peacock bass had been introduced. And there was a pike cichlid, I think Crenocicla brasiliensis. And I was just filming it with my camera, just standing waist deep and holding the camera underneath, kind of pointing at where it was. And there was a little boy living in a lean-to by the side of the river. And he was kind of playing in the river and his parents were hanging out in the lean-to. And he was curious about the camera. So he came over and I said, "Oh, have you seen this fish?" And he was like, "No." I'm like, it's by our feet right now. And he was like, "No." And I was like, "Yeah." And look here, let's look on the video. And he was like, "What's this fish called? What does it eat?" You know? And so I started telling him, "Oh, I didn't know that." And it was just such a, you know, I was quite emotional about it. And Juliana and I got to go back in our Jeep and drive off and have more adventures and eat nice meals. And he went back to his lean-to with his parents by the riverbank. But I had given him this tiniest snapshot into a part of the universe that he was very much part of, but had no idea existed. And, you know, who knows what goes with that. You know, I hope he has opportunities to do something. But if not, you never know. And I think that's sort of, again, the joy of connecting people with the nature that's around them, as you were saying with Ivan. You know, it's making people aware of what's there, telling them why it's important, and giving them ownership, making them stakeholders. And then they will very often be part of protecting it and celebrating it.
It's important.
Just had a question before we continue with where I was going with that. Is there a website or a link that you could share, or we could share for our pages to raise awareness for this sort of thing?
That's a really good question, because there isn't really. I think the best thing, you know, there's so many decent Facebook groups out there, you know, the Swordtail Facebook group, or the Fishes of North America, or the, you know, Amazon Basin Tetras group. You can learn so much, and you can talk with people where ideas come up. You become part of a bigger conversation, and it's not the same as perhaps posting on a website, because how many people who are not fish keepers are going to go to a website and read about, you know, the conservation of the glass finned, you know, micro rasbora from Sulawesi? They're not there. But the more people are engaged in the hobby, the more people that start picking up fish books, but also have spending capacity and their own voices, and kids and friends and, you know, colleagues, you start disseminating this out. So I think this is a very important role for the hobby. I think there is if you've got a platform to do it, contacting schools and educational bodies, talking to kids, asking your local zoo or public aquarium, is there something I can get involved with? Is there a way I can help, spread your messages? Can I volunteer? I mean, this is how I got my job with London Zoo. I started out as a volunteer aquarist, going on my days off from Cambridge down to London, and just because I wanted to be part of it. So it's very frustrating that there isn't like a sort of all-encompassing news board of, which species is threatened now and what habitat is on fire that threatens this fish. The reason there isn't is because there isn't an appetite among a general population for that. Is
that the kind of thing, they're not cute and fluffy and you can't pet them and they give you warm fuzzies, that people don't care quite as much?
Exactly. I was about to say, if you post, latest news, panda numbers have declined by 25% or something. Oh my God, money will be moved, voices will be raised, and yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Surely counts.
Had one of those for every kid. Messages will be posted. But again, it can be hard to not become frustrated by that. But if you then think, okay, so like, the I don't know, orangutan. Everyone's about the orangutans, but they live in rainforest and peat swamps, which are full of really cool fish. And if you protect the peat swamps and don't have the palm oil, so I think also part of it is perhaps rather than just focusing on a specific habitat or a specific species, look at a region or a wider ecosystem. Whether that's peat forests in Indonesia, mangroves in Florida, Amazon streams, general awareness and volunteering and participating and donating and in any small way. Those are the paths that are open to us, and I think those are the ones we have to walk.
Yeah, definitely. Find something furry, promote that, and by saving the furry animal, you save the fish.
Exactly. It's the flagship species thing. I mean,
yeah.
I had this when working at London Zoo. The millions of pounds put towards a panda or the Asian lion, and meanwhile we had all these like critically endangered pupfish from Mexico that were completely being eradicated in the wild, or we had the only 4 pairs on Earth, and God forbid I siphoned up one of the eggs by accident, and where was the money for that? But those charismatic, fluffy animals are part of ecosystems which have, wider range of species and communities of animals. And again, as you said, you hold up your fluffy fish, but you show that to a kid, 30 kids, one of them's going to think that's kind of cool. And that's the kid you say, hey, do you know this as well? And have you seen this?
Yeah.
So you tap into that.
Definitely.
So just leaning back towards the biotyping.
Yeah, so
is that the only way that you keep your aquariums now, or are you still open to other options?
I'd say I'm more in the other options, largely through not having any time.
Okay.
I've got a sort of loose Pantanal biotope thing in the kitchen and a very loose kind of Amazon one, but my main tank is a jungle. I tend to go jungle style. I love plants. I hate pruning. I can't start with like, this plant is being overshadowed by this, so I must, move it. No, if it dies, it dies. But if it flourishes, it flourishes.
You better hope George isn't watching this.
He knows me. He comes over to mine all the time, and he's like, "Where's that plant that you've?" It died. So I'm very good at growing some plants. So I've got a big tank in the garage, 150 by 60 by 60, about 400 something liters. And it's this, tangle of grassy plants and sword plants and Sagittarias and all sorts of things. And the fish love it. And I've got Smikeli, the LSP Smikeli. I've got the rainbow Emperor Tetras, Nematobrachum palmeri. There's green neons in there. There's Corydorus hastatus. It's a complete smorgasbord. The animals are really happy. The plants are flourishing. And so I'm open to that. I'm not one. I don't let myself get too crazy about the biotopes, but when I have the time and energy and dedication to set one up, I always do. I think it's a fun project. and it's so cool to, you know, have that slice of habitat. So yeah, there's sort of two very loose biotopes, and then this big planted tank at the moment. And I love doing planted biotopes, but then you see a plant that you really want, but it doesn't come from that habitat. And so now what are you going to do? You need some flexibility, and you can put it in, and, you know, it looks, yeah, I think, you know, being flexible and being able to engage in compromise is really important as a fish keeper and a hobbyist. You know, particularly you were saying in New Zealand, you're quite, you know, limited perhaps in what's available. You know, you got to cut your cloth with what you've got, and you can still do lots of cool stuff. But I think the most important thing is, you know, if you get pleasure out of it, and, you know, the animals and the plants are catered to, you know, don't worry too much if your biotope isn't 100% authentic or.
Yeah, I think having fun, it's a hobby. Hobbies are meant to be fun. It's first and foremost for anyone keeping aquariums, and probably as equal as, you know, making sure the animals and stuff we're keeping are kept as best condition they can. But, you know, those two work side by side. If you fish are loving their life, you're generally loving it as well. So it works. It just works together.
Exactly. And I think, I don't know if John has encountered this, but, you know, one of the things that I call it the gatekeeping. So, you know, you get some new and excited, naive fish keeper, and he says, I've created an Amazon biotope, and it's, you know, 3 or 4 Amazon swords plonked into some silver sand with a mix of tetras that are not found together. And people come, oh, this is crap, or, you know, you've used the plant from the left bank and the fish is from the right bank, and you need to go in there and say, hey, this is a really cool idea, but, you know, if you wanted to make it slightly more authentic, or, you know, perhaps in the future you might not use that fish but use this one, or maybe this plant is actually more accurate, and here's some photos of the habitat, and oh, have you seen this? You know, here's a video showing exactly what it's like. There's so many ways to educate people and encourage them to do better, if you like.
It's always easy to critique.
Oh yeah.
But it's empty unless you back it up and with a follow-up. But this is, like you said, you know, that this is how you can make it better, or otherwise you just put people off.
Exactly.
And you walk away from the hobby.
Exactly. That person gives up, goes and, I know, collects bottle caps or something, and we've lost an ally of freshwater fish, habitats, nature.
Yeah,
you know,
that's something I've seen so many times. We've run in Facebook groups for years. You see it. You get somebody that comes on, and you can see them. They get the fish tank, and then they try this and they try that, and they're just full of passion for the hobby. But slowly, you just get these people that come in that don't really know anything about anything, and they just pick away at them, and they just disappear, and then they just go away. They have a hobby of obscurity that they don't really like and they're not connected to because the community rejected them.
And exactly that. And it's not even the community. It'll be, you know, 5 out of 100 people.
Yeah. They're the most active ones 9 out of 10 times.
And as you said, you know, it's based mostly on ego. You know, people, and any hobby, any activity, this is going to exist. I bet there's stamp collectors out there who've given up because, you know, they put some stamps in the wrong order in their book and someone came and scoffed at it. But it's so easy, as you said, to do it right, to give really positive feedback and criticism and direct people to other sources and provide them with information and celebrate their attempts. I think that's what you kind of have to focus on. It's like, hey, I see it, as you said, all the time. Oh, your biotope is not correct. Well, hang on, like, they've made the effort, and now we can, you know, direct that energy towards something positive and help them to learn. But it's as with any online forum, especially, you know, there's always detractors, there's always ego, and I think the thing to do is find some guys on YouTube or on Facebook who are clearly authorities and are worth following, and, you know, are positive people. I've recently got to know Alexander Williamson in the States. It's The Secret Life of Your Aquarium. And I didn't really know him before, and I hadn't really watched his stuff. And then I started watching it. I was like, wow, here's someone who really loves nature, really loves fish keeping and fish keepers, and wants everyone to benefit and celebrate. And I was like, this is, you know, don't let the negative people into your space. Focus on someone like that Focus on someone positive, someone who really loves nature and wants to share that love with you.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally agree.
Yeah.
Andres asked a couple of questions. I'm just trying to work on the way of. Can you read the chat? Can you see that?
Let me see. Comments.
I'm not sure if it's on your screen or not.
I can see you've mentioned how Brazilians feel so detached from the Pantanal and the Amazon. New Zealanders surely feel even more distant from these environments. Well, that's a question for you.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, for sure. It's it's very, very difficult feeling being down this end of the world with how everything happens. It literally feels like we can't really do anything, or our not using shampoo with palm oil is so insignificant. It's not funny. So yeah, I totally agree with that. We feel very, very distant from everything. And as we were saying before, or before this started with the New Zealand waterways with our natives, they're challenging within themselves to keep. So even trying to do that is a challenge within itself as well. So yeah, totally feel that way, and I'm sure many people that live here feel that way as well.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose the only thing to say is that this is perhaps one of the better results of the internet. Is, we can open up our computers and within moments we have videos of habitats and we have information available, and we can find all sorts of things. I know a lot of scientific articles, for example, are behind paywalls, but if you use Google Scholar, you can actually access quite a lot of stuff free. If you search Hyphosabriconechis, serpetetras in Google Scholar, it'll show you so many articles and maybe images, and many of them you can access and read. Or you could go on YouTube and watch videos. And this is the amazing thing, the three of us, this guy in Scotland, the guy in England, the guy in New Zealand, talking about the same thing and passionate about the same thing and celebrating it with, Andre, who's from Brazil, and people, all around the world. It of course, we do feel distant. And especially if you haven't had the chance to go there and get your feet wet. But on the other hand, you can access it and access information in a way that no human being in the history of mankind has ever been able to do until the last 5-10 years.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's definitely transformed.
Oops. Oh, where you go, John? Oh,
no,
there you go.
Just the internet has definitely transformed fish keeping in every way.
To be able to, I've been writing my book, and I would not have been able to do this without seriouslyfish.com and Fishbase. And even if it's using Fishbase, then going to the sources that Fishbase have used or the sources that Seriously Fish have used, just to be able to go, oh, here's a species and here's the parameters that they need. And here's another one and here's another. And here's where it's distributed. Whereas, not long ago, I would have had to go through my library of bench and Dr. Axelrod. I would have had to go through maps, the amount of research. And yet, even as a layperson, I can very quickly access that information. I think that's magical.
Yeah, I agree.
Yes, it's really helpful.
Andres basically said he was trying to nudge you towards the Project Piaba.
Okay. So Project Piaba is this project in the Amazon, and it's designed to collect and export sustainably caught cardinal tetras, primarily, where there's a collection of indigenous communities within this region where they have become stakeholders in the industry of collecting these fish. And because the waterways where these fishes come from are now valuable economically to the communities, they set about protecting them, and they're advocates for stopping them being polluted by mining or disrupted by logging or sedimentation. So you get local people to become allies, and that's economically beneficial to them. I understand that the cardinals that they produce have a slightly higher price tag because they're sort of ethical. But you get to say, hey, I've got my wild caught cardinals, and they're from Project Piaba, which means, they're sustaining communities. And if you sustain those communities financially through this, then they're not engaging in logging, mining, whatever else they need to do to survive. It also helps to keep out outside influences such as, illegal mining groups, because the local people are not wanting to have this disruption.
You've got an income.
Yeah. So years and years ago, I had a friend, and he was a Brazilian friend, and we were talking about conservation, and I was still learning quite a lot. And he said, look, you cannot put a fence around a habitat and keep people out to protect an animal or an ecosystem. People will always find a way in, whether it's greed, desperation, necessity, people will find a way in. What you need to do is bring people inside the fence and say, hey, what is here is good for you, whether that's mentally, financially, environmentally. And then you get people to protect what's in that fence. And I think Project Piaba are doing that in their own small way, which is fantastic. And I have very uneasy feelings about wild caught species in many cases. And, I think this is a really good example of how to do it correctly.
Yep. Something I want, slightly off topic but completely on topic, is what I've thoroughly enjoyed when we have these conversations with people. I think you might be the 25th, 26th guest or something like that we've had on, but things like Project Piaba comes up often, and the things that come up on a regular basis, like, it's so exciting that there's lots of people that are involved and know of these things that are doing such positive things. And yeah, it's fantastic that things like this do continually reoccur and the conversation is continuously had, so more and more people are becoming aware or getting involved or anything with it. I think it's fantastic.
I agree, and I think it's such a it's a nice foil to. We have this doom scrolling, right? You open up your website, your chosen news website, and the Amazon is on fire, the Congo is being ripped apart for batteries for mobile phones, the peat forests are being chopped down. There's relentless negative information about our planet and our species and our own impact upon it, and it can be really hard to find the little nuggets of positive news and people who are doing great things and finding ways to work alongside nature and see humans and nature benefit. And then, you encounter that in those conversations, and the more it's heard, the more it's reiterated, the more people are aware of it, and people can go, okay, yeah, there's all this bad stuff going on, but in the face of all of that, look at what these people are doing. I saw something last year, which was interesting, about forests in the Amazon, where they were engaging with indigenous groups. I can't remember. I think it's called the Amazon Seed Program or something like this. Maybe Andre will know. They engaged with indigenous groups in areas of the Amazon which had already been heavily deforested or degraded. And they crowdsource and fund seeds of various trees and plants, and they bring them to these communities. And the communities are responsible for mixing up the seeds, because it's no good planting 5,000 of one kind of tree. You need a matrix of different species. And then they get the kids and the adults and everyone else to go out with these huge baskets of seeds and disperse them over ground that's been partially cleared or degraded or is, scrub. And then the rains come and those seeds germinate. And it's the local community who's given the resources in the form of seeds to take action to restore the rainforest where they once lived, and will in the long term benefit from that. And I think that sort of thing, whether that's with seeds or with fishes or birds, is so powerful, and is the sort of thing that should be on the front page of every major newspaper and on every news website. This week we planted 5 million, seeds in the Amazon basin. By the way, isn't this cool? Obviously we have to go and hunt for that information, but doing so, it gives us those little bits of hope that are integral to existing successfully. I think.
So Andre's now asked basically a direct question, I believe, to me. Regarding how do we ensure we get more sustainably collected fish, and then he's followed it up with we get quite a lot of wild caught fish in New Zealand and no idea where they've been coming from. So to that point, the supply lists that I buy from, they'll write if they're wild caught. In the last 6 months, I can only think of 2 or maybe 3 fish that have said wild caught on them. There's bleeding hearts that have come through, one of the suppliers, and one L128 plecos that have come through. I think a lot of the wild caught fish that are currently here in New Zealand have been brought in by individual private importers, not via the main commercial importers. But you have raised a really good question on how do we ensure or try and get more sustainably caught or produce fish in New Zealand, and I've written myself a note for that, and I'm going to try and formulate something to the suppliers, ask some questions, and see how that can work through. Because I think you've made a really good point and brought up a really good question. So I'll be working around with that over the next little while for who I can contact and email and work out how we can, make sure these are noted and sustainable and that sort of stuff for what we have here.
There must be some sort of key information that can validate the I can't get the word, but it can grade how sustainable these fish are when they're coming in.
Yeah. So my root thought is that the commercial importers into New Zealand, where there is only 3 off the top of my head, they buy a vast majority of their fish from farms over in Asia.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's possibly not the New Zealand importers, it's the step in the chain beforehand that needs to be questioned, because I believe with them writing on the supply list that these are wild caught, that if they are bringing in wild caught, everyone's knowing when it gets to the stores that they are wild caught. So it's a step before that might be the question that needs to be asked.
Yeah.
Andre mentioned about prices there. I don't know if it was with Andre or someone I was speaking to about discus. They had a guy in the Amazon and they paid him more than the usual value. And basically his remit was, I want you to go out and collect discus for me, but only want you to collect the best ones. I don't want you to over collect from any habitat. If you take 20 and only 5 of them are really good, put the other 15 back. I don't want you to bring them to me because I can't sell them for the same value. Use some very small local operations, but those discus had a high price tag, as Andre pointed out. I wonder if there's any mileage or possibility in being able to break down pricing to clients and customers and say, the reason you're paying this surplus for this fish is because it's not some, dodgy fish farm or, large scale exporter. There's a guy who every Thursday gets in the canoe and goes out, into the flooded forest, and he picks these fish and puts the others back, and we need to pay him more so he doesn't then decide to, sensibly go and collect tons of fish and just bring them to the nearest wholesaler, say, look, here's 200 discus, pay me. So that does remain sustainable. It's the same concept of Project Piaba. Like, yeah, you're paying 50 cents more for your cardinal, but this is collected in a sustainable way, and it has a benefit to communities and individuals rather than large. I'm sure it's very hard to publicize that and have it, but if there was a way.
That's something that the Amazon Research Centre are doing already as well.
Okay.
In Peru, they work with the local fishermen, and they've chosen to be they collect. So they're almost eradicated by catching. There's fish that are illegal, but they're getting put out export anyway. So they've worked really hard to get that kind of pushed back, and the fishermen are kind of hyper focusing on specific species to up the value of them, and a lot of the lower quality or the smaller fish get put into aquafarms to try and grow them out sustainably as well.
It's such a difficult situation. Like I know from in Rio Xingu and other parts of the Amazon, with the demand for rare L numbers, particularly, there are criminal organizations that are involved because it's so lucrative. The risks are very low, and you get a guy to go down, dive, collect five fish or whatever. There's always a market for them. If they die before they arrive, well, okay, you haven't really spent very much. But if they do get in, people will spend good money on them. And it's finding the ways to monitor it and make it sustainable. It's very difficult, but I'm convinced there are ways to do it, as you were saying, to do it correctly.
Definitely.
What are your overall thoughts on wild caught fish? Are you pro, against, depending on how it's done? What's your general thought on that?
I'd say it entirely is based on context and the individual situation. So as we were saying, if a habitat is worth more in a non-degraded, non-damaged format, because the fish that are collected from it are used for the industry and they're not over collected, then that's the way to go. If it's, wholesale removal, like we had with denizen barbs and other species, then it's clearly the wrong. Anything that can be bred in captivity, I think should be bred in captivity for market, just so that we, take the pressure off habitats. You can say, oh, well, we've only collected 10,000 out of a total population of 100,000 of a fish each year. Say, okay, but what happens if there's, an El Nino or some other environmental impact that suddenly wipes out 90,000? On the other hand, I think, I had this thing with my friend Luis Tencacci in Brazil, in the Pantanal, and in Brazil generally, it's very hard to, and in the state of Mato Grosso do Sul, it was illegal to collect fishes and breed them in small-scale operations for domestic and international aquarium trade. The state didn't allow it. So what happens in the case of black neons, for example, the local pet store near me, every week they had a tank with 3,000 black neons in, and I could clearly see that they were wild, because many of them are infected with the trematode parasite that turns fishes gold, like gold tetras. So I knew they were gold. And so you get these amazing gold black neons, and the guy would say, oh yeah, these came from the supplier in Sao Paulo. It's like, they clearly didn't. They've been caught from the Taquari Basin, 200 miles that way, by some guy who's gone in with a net, collected 3,000 of these fish every week. And a lot of them are sold almost as, they're so cheap, they're sold as like feeder fish for Oscars and stuff.
Right.
And very quickly, that population will decline. But if you legalized the production of that species within the state, you cut out those poachers, those middlemen, you create economic enterprises which can benefit a community, and the wild ones are left alone.
Regulated as well, properly.
Exactly. But as with, orchids or with anything else, it's, the rarity of a species and the difficulty in acquiring it drives up the price, drives up demand. And there's always going to be people who say, oh, I could buy wild caught, rainbow fish, tank bred rainbow fish, but I want the wild ones because those are there's always going to be that. And in the case where it's a sustainable and economically viable system with benefits for people and nature, I'd say yes. As soon as it gets detrimental, I'd say, hey, if we can't breed it in captivity, we don't have it in the hobby. It's fine. Okay. There's how many other species are there we could choose? Sorry, that was a very long answer to your question. So.
No, it's a valid, absolutely valid answer. I think we'd be doing you a bit of a disservice if we didn't talk about your book that you've got coming up.
Yes.
So yeah, like I know many of us are aware that you've got a book due to be released very soon. So do you want to go into a bit of a detail about that, where that came from, where you're at with that, and everything else that goes with it?
The first thing, and you hear it here first to know, is that the release date, after talk yesterday, the publisher contacted me and they're like, yeah, we know that the release date for the US was October, for the UK is January. It looks like the US release date now will be January. And this is because the process for printing the books requires them to be put into a dehumidifying chamber for several weeks.
Oh.
To sort of desiccate them. And I didn't know this, and my editor didn't know this. And then the producers were like, yeah, this is something we need to do. And it stops the pages crinkling up and it keeps the books long term. So ultimately, it's great for the buyer because your book is likely to last much longer. Frustratingly, after having said last week, it'll be out in October, it's likely to be January and perhaps a bit later in the UK. So you hear that here first. I'm doing everything I can to get it done and out. As I said I think Cameron, I've been writing a lot, and it's nearly done, but there's lots of bits and pieces that have to come together. So what is the book? The book is a kind of step-by-step guide to creating displays that represent natural habitats. I've avoided using the term biotopes so that I don't make lots of people angry. I say natural style displays. So essentially they are biotopes, but hey, there might be some flexibility We're also incorporating aquascaping philosophy and aesthetics, and some of them are more rigid and authentic than others. But the idea is to get people to think about how to create natural style displays for their fishes and plants. And then the book talks about the human and natural history and wider context of the places where those fishes and plants come from.
Right.
So, you know, if you want your Amazon rainforest creek, you would, as long as the editors don't cut too much out, you'll also get a kind of general history of the Amazon, wider history of, you know, ecological, natural history. But in every display, I also talk about the environmental threats that face those species and those habitats. And I'm trying to include, you know, human interest as well as natural history. So if you want to, you can just go by the kind of technical step-by-step. I want to create my Pantanal meadow wet season display. I'm going to read the step-by-step bit and the ingredients page. But you could also have a, you know, read the rest of it and learn about the history of the Pantanal and its dynamics and its ecology, and, you know, so it's a very large piece of work. There's going to be 62 displays in it from around the world. I did set up 96 for the book, and it nearly killed me.
I was going to ask about that. Actually, that was one of the questions I was going to ask. How many?
Heavy. Well, George Farmer and I went through. I mean, I said to him, George, pick the ones that jump out at you. And the publisher were like, yeah, I think we can fit like 50, maybe 55. And I was like, nah, I think we can fit maybe 60. Well, actually 62, or maybe 60. So I'm very much hoping that the 62 go in there. But as I said, there's a lot of words and it's being edited as we speak. Otherwise, it will end up being very, very large. It's just going to be in a coffee table book format. So I think it's 34 centimeters by 22 something. So we're hoping for, you know, it's very photo heavy. And I can say this to you guys, when I pitched it to the publisher, I said, look, I want this book to be the sort of book that, you know, an auntie walking through a bookshop sees it and goes, oh, I've got a nephew who's into fish, and I'll get in this book. Equally, someone who's a hardcore biotoper is going to go, you know what, I want that in my library. And someone who's maybe keeping fish, has some guppies, platies, a couple of, you know, plants plonked in the gravel, and has seen other things and wants to advance, could pick it up and learn from it. I pitched it to the publishers. I said, look, what I want is a book where, imagine there's a couple in bed, and one of them is a real fish nerd and aquarium enthusiast, and the other one couldn't care less. And the one who's the enthusiast gets out of bed and goes and has a shower and leaves the book open on the bed. And the non-enthusiast partner starts idly flipping through it. And there's enough human interest, general natural history, anecdotes, stories, facts in there that they actually start reading through it and become interested in it. And the book is not just, you know, my voice. I've got voices of various people in it. Ivan Mikolji is in it, Tomas Minesi in Congo, Jason Solder in Australia, all these fantastic people who are, you know, contributing data, stories, anecdotes, their own observations. You know, Roman Burkhardt, a nice German friend of mine, has provided information on, you know, exploring the creeks of Tennessee, you know, all this kind of stuff that I haven't had the luxury to go out to those particular habitats, but I've got people, there's guys in Thailand, Indonesia, sending me stuff, sending me photos, sending me stories, sending me information, and I'm trying to get as much of it as I can into that book. So that's the pitch, and I very much like it.
I am excited for it. Obviously, I've been following you for quite a while, and I've watched it sort of slowly develop and everything that's went along with it in part of the journey. And yesterday, I placed my order on Amazon, so I am.
Thank you.
Very excited. It's slightly disappointed it's going to take till next year.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
I understandable, and it'll be worth the wait.
Thank you. I'm honored, and I'm honored that you put your trust in me, because it's very kind of you, and I appreciate it.
It's a book that I think I'm excited about the book in itself, because I think it's going to hold a lot of information that's going to be helpful to me. I like pictures, and if it's got half of what I've seen you put online, it'll be worth it.
My poor editor is like, you want how many photos in there? And, you know, I'm like, yeah, but I've got these really cool photos of this habitat in Thailand. So I'm going to see what I can get in, but it will be photo heavy.
Well, this wall is going to have a bookcase on it. All my books are going to go, so it's going to be there along beside all the other books.
Well, that is a real honor. I can tell you a little story. When I was starting to think about doing this book seriously, a friend of mine said, "Oh, I've got a friend. She's training as a life coach, and she's got experience in business and planning. Why don't you could be her guinea pig? She needs someone to complete her course." So I thought, okay. She was fantastic. And I told her about this book project. And her first question to me, she didn't want to know about the money. She said, "What would it mean to you if you walked into a store or someone's room and you saw your book on the bookshelves?" And I was like, "It would mean the world." And she was like, "That's what you have to remember." And so to hear you say, "I'll have it on my bookshelf in my home," that completely rekindles that memory and reminds me of how amazing a feeling that is and what a privilege it is. So thank you.
No, you're welcome.
Really pleased. I've got to plug 2 books whilst I'm here, and I've been writing a bit. This is a book by John Tulloch, who is the man with the most fantastic voice in the world. He's from Eastern Tennessee, and you'll want him to be your grandfather because of the way he speaks. And I got this when I was at university, years ago. And Freshwater Aquarium Models. It's not with photos. He doesn't actually set up any tanks, but it's full of recipes for displays, biotopes around the world. And some are, more authentic than others, but it's really good. And I don't know if you guys know a book called, now I can't find it, The Complete Aquarium, which is here. So my mum gave this to me for my 9th birthday, and here's her dedication. And this book is, even in 1992 or so, was already obsolete. It's by Peter W. Scott, and it contains aquariums that will make you go, Southeast Asian display with Pangasius, Siamese fighters, tiger barbs, gouramis, red-tailed sharks in shoals. But this was the book that kind of inspired the one I want to do.
Right, okay.
Because it was kind of, so for example, he gives you a Papua New Guinea sandy river, context of the habitat and the tank, ingredients page, and then a list of suitable species, a very simple step-by-step, and then the finished tank. And this is, under gravel filters, plants plonked into sand and gravel, massively wrong in some ways, the displays and the fish selection. But I was thinking about this when I came back from Brazil, and I thought about it for a while. I said, this is a 30-year-old book, and no one's done an update. With all the fish, all the equipment, all the plants, all the knowledge that we've accrued since this was published, you could do something really cool. You could produce a version of that for the 21st century that would have a life of 30 years for people to pick up and go, oh, this was cool. Maybe now it's a bit outdated, but look, it inspired me to set up this tank. I read that book almost every night as a kid. I can sort of memorize it. I had a copy for home and a copy for university, even though I knew it was obsolete. It inspired me. Here's how you set up an African rapids tank. Here's how you set up a Papua New Guinea river. Here's how you set up a East Coast, West Coast African swamp. I mean, it was magical. And so I'm hoping that, my mum bought that for me as a little boy who loved fish and stuff and, had a fish tank. But I'm hoping that my book has that same story, whether it's for an expert or a beginner or an intermediate. It'll sit on their bookshelf and they'll keep opening it and going back to something, and might be years down the line, but it'll still be relevant and still have something to offer.
Absolutely. I think
there's a couple of things that have just come up through this little 5 minutes or so. First of all, I love that you call them recipes. I think that's fantastic. That's absolutely fantastic. Secondly, as soon as you started talking about the books, you could feel that the passion and the love for them and the information that was in them was just streaming out of you. It was absolutely fantastic. As well as that, I know at least 2 or 3 people that have already pre-ordered from here in New Zealand, and by the look of the chat, there's 2 or 3 other people that are pretty keen on pre-ordering. So where would they go to do that?
I believe Amazon. I know that Amazon is pre-ordering it. That's very kind of them, and I really appreciate it. I have to say that I have nothing to do at this point with the marketing, the selling. I didn't even know it was available for pre-order until my friend James texted me and said, "Hey, your book's available for pre-order," and I was like, "I did not know this." And I know that Amazon, as far from what I understand, Amazon offer it, and the price that they offer it for is kind of what they estimate they'll be paying for it down the line. So it may go up in price at some point. It may not. I don't know. And I don't know what the deal is with Amazon shipping to New Zealand. I have had a message from a gentleman who, I'm sorry, I forgot his name. He has a fish shop in New Zealand, and he's contacted me and said, "Hey, would your book be available for wholesale so I can get copies in?" And I think once it's out in print, that'll be an option. I'm sure there'll be a way. So it may be available in stores. I could talk to you about that as well, Cameron. So I don't know what the deal will be, but I think if Amazon ship it to New Zealand, maybe that may be the way to do it. If you want to avoid Amazon and you're happy to wait, I think either we can find a way to maybe distribute it out there through a company, or if it's a case of, if people are willing to pay for the postage, I'm looking to have copies that I will sign and be able to send to people who really want, signed copies and dedicated copies. So I'm hoping that there will be a way to get books out to everyone who wants one. But I'm so honored to, it's such a magical feeling that people on the other side of the world are like, "Hey, I want to buy your book." And it's quite sort of surreal in some moments. You're like, I'm banging away at my computer cursing because I've had to write the word fish for the millionth time. I never want to see it again. But there are moments when I'm like, I can't write right now. I don't want to do it today. I want to do something else. And then I realize, people have put money down on you. People have put their trust in you. You owe it to people to get this book done, to get it out there and get it as good as it can possibly be. Get back to your desk and write. And that's one of my motivating things. The other thing to point out vis-a-vis the slight delay, and I spoke about this with the editor, because the publishers wanted it kind of ready for Christmas because that's a boom sale. I said I would rather produce a really good book that doesn't make the Christmas sales and that people will love than a book that could have been better but made it in time for Christmas. Exactly. So I asked for forgiveness in terms of the book not being available at that time, but I hope as a consequence it will still be a much better book.
It'll be ready for Father's Day.
Well, there you go. And who doesn't want to get a Christmas present in January or later? So
an acceptable one, that's for sure.
Well,
I'll definitely be in contact about potentially getting some and being able to push them through New Zealand. We did the same thing with Ivan with his book when it was available. So people don't have to worry about the shipping costs and the time. I dealt with that, and people got books. Everyone was happy. So I'd be quite happy to do that again.
Just mentioning Ivan's book there, Tai. We never ever did get that book review organised. Understandable.
John messaged me like 18 months ago, like, "Hey, Tai, no, maybe 2 years now. Would you be happy to do a review of Ivan's book?" And I was like, "Yeah." And then I am very sorry, John. That's terrible.
No, your book kicked on. Everything started at that point, I think, as well. So
the thing is, I can wax lyrical about Ivan's book, for days, and I would still like to do something like that. Let me finish this manuscript first. We could all, even if it's we'll figure something out. I have this, it sounds terribly arrogant, but I get a lot of messages now on Instagram particularly, and many of them are from people like John who I want to hear from, and friends and contacts and questions, and they get pushed down and down and down, and I find that I need to take once in the week 2 or 3 hours to sit down and try and respond to everyone. I do try and respond to everyone. So if people have tried to contact me there and I haven't responded, I am sorry. Just the volume of messages and the time that it takes, which I should be writing.
Well, I could imagine.
In recent, my mother had major heart surgery less than 2 weeks ago, so I'm sort of looking after her as well. So I'm doing that and trying to get the book done. So I apologize if I haven't responded to people. It's not that I don't want to. It's just I get overwhelmed.
Yeah,
But yes, I owe you a book review, John, and I apologize for not getting that to you.
Oh, don't worry. Don't worry at all.
I think it's my time to apologise because unfortunately we're running out of time again. I've got to open up my shop in about 10 minutes. So I don't know how many times I've said this. I'm sure if we had another 10 hours, we could sit here and talk for another 10 hours about fish. So again, thank you very much for taking your time out of what is obviously a very busy day with your book writing to be with us.
Oh, thank you.
I like to close all of our coffee dates when we've got guests with a set of really quick 6 questions. They won't put you on the spot. They're just a little bit of fun to close off with.
Okay.
So my first question for you is, if you had a superpower, what would it be?
Oh my God. Don't put me on the spot. You know what? I think it would be give everybody empathy. I know that's cliche, but if you're going to save the world, that's how it starts. Whether it's with people or animals, that's how it starts.
Cool. Do you think we're alone in the universe?
I don't. I think the universe is so large that whether it's an amoeba or an advanced civilization, I'm pretty sure we are not the only life in the universe. And if we are, we better do something better than we're doing. But I don't think we are.
If you're doing a coin toss, are you heads or tails?
Oh, tails.
Tails never fails.
I have to look at my head all the time. Who wants to do?
Left or right-handed?
I'm right-handed.
Cool. If you could have a meal with anybody, either dead or alive, who would that be?
David Attenborough.
Very cool. Very cool. And this one is open to your entire interpretation. What is a unicorn fish for you? Haven't seen in the wild, photographed, kept in an aquarium. That one's totally open to you.
Green neons.
Green neons?
Green neon tetra. If I got to see a green neon tetra in the wild, because that's the first fish I ever saw. It's the first fish I have in my memory. Cool. To see them in the wild would just be like
full circle.
Yeah,
cool, fantastic.
I'll go with you, and we can see the rams at the same time.
Definitely.
That's our 6, and that's what we've got. So once again, thank you very much. It's really appreciated. I know you're very busy at the moment, so fantastic. And by the look of the comments in the chat, there's a lot of people that have taken a lot from this and have really enjoyed it as well. So really appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you to you both, and have a good day, Cam, and have a good night, John.
Yeah, you too. Best of luck with your mum.
Thank you, guys.
Right. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week. Have a good one, Sam.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.
Catch you later.